becoming, I suspect, increasingly unsettled by the prolonged disappearance of the commander of Ukraine's military, General Zaluzhny. Now, General Zaluzhny has been built up both in Ukraine and in the West as a kind of heroic figure, a commander of enormous ability and skill. And he was, of course, on the cover, I think it was of Time magazine or Newsweek or one of those anyway. He's been widely built up as a sort of, well, a kind of General Lee type figure, I suppose. Americans will understand whom I'm referring to, the commander of the Confederate armies during the Civil War, a man of immense tactical skill as a general. And Zaluzhny, it seems to me, comparisons can be made that resemble the way in which General Lee was being promoted at the time of the Civil War by the people in the South. Well, he hasn't been visible for a long time, and we've been told all kinds of stories about where he is, that he's been attending a wedding. There's been pictures published of him on holiday in Cyprus. Why he would be on holiday in Cyprus at this time is mysterious, but people have established that those photographs were actually taken some time ago. And of course, rumours that he is dead or injured are also starting to gain traction. And I have discounted these rumours up to now, and I'm going to say straight away that I still don't believe them. But anyway, it's unsurprising, given his relative invisibility, that people are starting to have doubts and are wondering what has become of General Zaluzhny. And the reason I think that he probably is still alive and probably uninjured is quite apart from the fact that he's reported to have had some kind of discussion with General Milley, a telephone conversation with General Milley. I'm going to try and second guess what it was about, but apparently there's a video now appeared of him attending a Science Day conference. It appeared on YouTube. Odd place for it to appear, but there was a brief sight of him there, Zaluzhny there. He looked, from what I could see, safe and well. But again, it's not the kind of high-profile visibility that you would expect a general, the commander of the Ukrainian army, to be engaging in at a time like this, when there is a military crisis in Donbass and Ukraine is said to be preparing some kind of an offensive. Now, point can be validly made that we don't often hear very much about Russian commanders. Gerasimov, Surovikin, people like that, they too tend to be more on the invisible side, but that has been the style of the Russians throughout. Whereas Zaluzhny, by contrast, has seen to court publicity. So why is he making himself invisible in this way? Well, I suspect that he's been unhappy about the fight over Bakhmut for some time. There were lots of reports that he wanted to pull the Ukrainian troops from there. He appears to have been overruled by Zelensky, the president, and General Syrskyi, the ground forces commander. And I also get the sense that Zaluzhny has little faith in this offensive that he's been ordered to undertake in Zaporozhye region. Back in the autumn, he gave an interview with The Economist in which he set out a shopping list of all the equipment that he needed: 300 tanks, 600 to 700 infantry fighting vehicles, 500 howitzers. He's only received a fraction of that. And he's not just got a fraction of the armoured vehicles and artillery pieces that he wanted, but it seems that he's not had much in the way of the artillery shells that he says that he would logically need for such an offensive. And of course, what's also been happening over the last few days, weeks in fact, is that the Russians have been engaging in a huge bombing missile campaign right across Ukraine, striking Ukrainian targets, carrying out attacks on ammunition depots, oil facilities, logistical bases, warehouses, barracks, that sort of thing, right across the entirety of Ukraine. And yesterday was another case of this. There was an enormous combined missile drone attack, both cruise missiles and ballistic rockets, Iskander missiles and cruise missiles, all of them struck Dnipro, a city the Russians call Dnipropetrovsk. There's apparently an enormous amount of damage done there. Again, the Russians are claiming that they've destroyed all kinds of logistical positions and ammunition dumps put together by Ukraine for the Zaporozhye offensive. Dnipro does seem to be one of the key base areas where the Ukrainians have been assembling their troops and their supplies for the offensive. It's logical that the Russians would therefore want to strike at it. Anyway, they do appear to have struck it hard yesterday, at the same time as they've been carrying out other missile and drone attacks right across Ukraine, and also bombing attacks, including, by the way, very heavy bombing on positions, Ukrainian positions, near Bakhmut itself, attacking Ukrainian troops located close to Bakhmut. And as I think I mentioned, there's now reports that there's an evacuation underway from Chasov Yar, this town to the west of Bakhmut, that civilians are being told to leave Chasov Yar, and that could be a sign, as I said, that there's not just a heavy missile and bombing campaign against Chasov Yar, but possibly a Russian offensive against this town. So, big Russian missile bombing offensive across Ukraine, hitting Ukraine's limited supplies of ammunition and fuel. And that might be another reason why General Zaluzhny doesn't want to be visible. He's not happy, that's my impression, with the outcome of the Battle of Bakhmut. He doesn't want to be blamed for it. He apparently advised against it. He thought that holding on to Bakhmut made little sense, and so it has perhaps turned out. And he's not keen on this offensive either. He feels that this offensive is a mistake, that Ukraine isn't ready, its forces aren't ready, and it's not going to achieve very much if it conducts this offensive now. And last but not least, the latest wonder weapon that the West has supplied to Ukraine, the British Storm Shadow. Well, if you believe Russian reports, the Russians are having no difficulty shooting it down. Like every day now, there are more reports from the Russian Defense Ministry of more Storm Shadow missiles being shot down by the Russian air defense. Now, again, there's no corroboration of this, but I suspect that these reports are true. We are seeing continued Ukrainian attempts at missile strikes, attacks by drones across the front lines, but they do seem to be increasingly ineffective. They're making little real impact on the battlefronts. They're not able, so it seems, to break through. And perhaps one last thing which tells us how surreal in some ways the war has become, from a Ukrainian point of view at least, is that earlier today, lots of reports were circulating that a Ukrainian reconnaissance group had crossed into Belgorod region, into Russia, and that they'd advanced and been confronted by the Russian army, and that there was intense fighting going on between this reconnaissance group and the Russian army, and we were all waiting to hear about the outcome of this fight, except that the Russians now saying that nothing like that happened, that the whole thing was invented, that it was a fake, that presumably the Ukrainian authorities engineered a story based around all of this in order, again, to unsettle the mood in Russia, perhaps possibly raise morale in Ukraine, but that this was a battle fought entirely in a virtual way. It wasn't real. Of course, I'm not in Belgorod. I'm not able to say definitely about this one way or the other. And lastly, just to tie up one last loose end, I noticed that Simplicius the thinker, in one of his latest pieces, has now re-examined what happened to that Russian air group that was shot down about a couple of days ago, the Sukhoi 34 and 35 and the two Mi-8 helicopters, and he's come to the conclusion that this was almost definitely a friendly fire incident. In other words, this air group was shot down by Russian air defences, mistakenly shooting down their own aircraft. There have been other instances of that over the course of the conflict. In other words, according to Simplicius the thinker, it didn't involve Ukraine. The Ukrainians weren't directly involved, and that might explain why, despite that incident, the Russian Air Force continues to operate across Ukraine without hindrance. Well, there we are. That seems to be, as far as I can see, the situation on the battlefronts in Ukraine today. Not, as you will gather, a huge amount of detailed information. With Bakhmut lost, a lot of the, if I can put it like this, reporting energy has gone out of the war. I do get the sense Pushilin is claiming, for example, that the Russians are continuing to make significant progress in places like Marinka and Avdiivka. I'll quote